The fire in Ezra Holden's cabin had been out for 6 days, but when Graham Sutton pushed open the door expecting to find a frozen corpse, he found Ezra sitting at his table in shirt sleeves, the cabin warm enough that frost hadn't even formed on the windows. The metal lid set flush in the floor still radiated heat from a fire that had died nearly a week earlier, and what Graham saw that morning would change how every trapper in the northern Rockies survived the brutal winters that killed men with ruthless efficiency. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees sometime during the night of February 23, 1839. Ezra Holden woke in the small cabin he shared with Calvin Reed to find their fire reduced to ash and the water bucket frozen solid near the door. Calvin was already awake, pulling on extra layers of wool and fur in the pre-dawn darkness. They had trap lines to check 3 miles upriver, and beaver didn't care about cold snaps that could kill a man in less than an hour of exposure. Ezra rebuilt the fire while Calvin prepared their packs. The morning routine was automatic after sharing a cabin for 2 winters. They had established an efficient partnership. Calvin checked the northern trap lines while Ezra worked the southern routes. They met back at the cabin each evening to process pelts and prepare the next day's equipment. Calvin left at first light. Ezra stayed behind to finish processing 3 beaver pelts from the previous day's haul. Around midday, he heard 3 distant gunshots from the direction Calvin had gone. 3 shots meant trouble. 1 shot killed a beaver. 2 shots might mean a missed opportunity. 3 shots meant something had gone wrong. Ezra grabbed his rifle and headed toward the sound. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the cold was a physical force that drove needles into any exposed skin. He followed Calvin's tracks along the frozen creek. He found Calvin 2.5 miles from the cabin, sitting in the snow with his back against a pine tree. His rifle lay beside him. He had fired 3 times at a wolf that had appeared while he was checking a trap. The wolf was gone, but Calvin had fallen through thin ice into a beaver pond while trying to escape. Calvin's clothes were frozen to his body. His hands were clumsy, unable to work properly. He recognized Ezra, but his words came slowly, slurred by hypothermia's grip. Ezra got him standing and moving, knowing that returning to the cabin was their only chance. The journey back took over an hour. Calvin stumbled frequently. His body was shutting down, conserving heat for vital organs. By the time they reached the cabin, Calvin could barely walk. The fire had died while Ezra was gone. The cabin interior was only marginally warmer than the outside air. Ezra's hands shook as he tried to restart the fire. The flint and steel seemed impossibly difficult to work. Calvin sat wrapped in blankets, shivering violently at first, then not shivering at all. When the body stopped shivering, it meant the core temperature had dropped too far. Ezra got the fire going eventually, but it took 15 minutes that felt like hours. He stripped Calvin's frozen clothes and wrapped him in every blanket they owned, pulling him close to the growing flames. Calvin's breathing was shallow. He mumbled something about keeping the fire going, about how they should have kept it going. His eyes lost focus. Sometime around midnight, he stopped breathing. Ezra sat with the body until dawn, feeding the fire constantly. When the sun rose, he wrapped Calvin in canvas and carried him to a hillside overlooking the creek. The ground was frozen too hard to dig properly. He covered the body with stones and marked the location. Walking back to the cabin alone, Ezra understood something with absolute clarity. The wilderness hadn't killed Calvin Reed. Inadequate shelter had. Spring came to the mountains in late April 1839, and Ezra Holden finished his trapping season alone. The work was mechanical now, something his hands could do while his mind worked on a different problem entirely. He couldn't stop thinking about cabin heating and the fundamental inadequacy of how mountain men kept themselves alive through winter. Calvin's death had exposed a truth that seemed obvious in retrospect. Every trapper's survival depended on maintaining a fire that required constant attention, and that dependency created hundreds of opportunities for fatal failure. Ezra began visiting other trappers' camps as he worked his way through the spring beaver runs. He examined their fireplaces and heating methods with the attention most men reserve for studying animal tracks or weather patterns. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same basic design: a stone or mud fireplace built against one wall, a chimney rising through the roof, and a constant need for fuel and tending. The fires needed fresh wood every 4 to 6 hours, or they died completely. No trapper could sleep through a full night in deep winter without waking to feed the flames. He listened to stories that other men told casually, accepting them as normal costs of mountain life. Tobias Warren had lost 3 toes to frostbite 2 winters earlier when his fire went out during a night he'd been too exhausted to wake and tend it properly. Everett Shaw had left his cabin for a 3-day hunt the previous autumn and returned to find everything frozen solid, including his water supply and stored food. The cabin had been uninhabitable for 2 days while he worked to restore basic warmth. These weren't considered tragedies. They were simply the expected hardships of choosing to live in the wilderness. But Ezra started calculating the mathematics of these hardships. A typical winter in the Northern Rockies lasted 120 days, from November through February. If a fire needed tending every 6 hours, that meant 4 times per day. Over a full winter, that was 480 separate moments when a man had to wake up, get out of his bedroll, and feed flames back to life. 480 opportunities for something to go wrong. A man could be sick, injured, delayed on a trapline, caught in a blizzard away from shelter. Any of those 480 moments could be the one where the fire died and didn't get restarted in time. Ezra found himself sketching designs in a journal he'd started keeping. The sketches weren't of trap placements or animal behavior. They were architectural drawings, crude but detailed, showing different fireplace configurations and heating systems. He drew chimneys with different angles, fireboxes with different dimensions, trying to understand why so much heat escaped upward instead of staying in the living space. Other trappers who saw his journal thought he was losing his mind. One told him directly that grief had broken something in his thinking, that he should focus on trapping and let the dead stay buried. But Ezra couldn't let it go. He had watched his partner die because a fire went out, and he couldn't accept that this was simply how things had to be. There had to be a better solution. He finished his spring trapping and prepared for the journey to St. Louis to sell his furs. But this trip would be different from previous years. He wasn't going to sell pelts and drink away the profits. He was going to find answers. Ezra reached St. Louis in early June 1839 and sold his beaver pelts for a respectable price. Most trappers celebrated the end of a season by spending their earnings on whiskey, gambling, and temporary companionship. Ezra spent his money on education. He had 3 weeks before he needed to return to the mountains to prepare for the next trapping season, and he intended to use every day studying how buildings held and distributed heat. He started at a bakery near the riverfront, where he'd noticed smoke rising from chimneys long before dawn. He introduced himself to the baker and asked if he could observe the ovens. The baker, confused but accommodating, showed him the massive brick structures that dominated the workspace. Ezra watched as the man built a fire in the evening and let it burn for several hours until the bricks glowed with absorbed heat. Then the fire was allowed to die completely. The baker explained that the ovens would stay hot enough to bake bread for 2 full days without any additional fire. The bricks themselves became the heat source, releasing stored thermal energy slowly and consistently. Ezra spent an entire afternoon examining those ovens, touching the bricks at different distances from the fire chamber, feeling how the heat spread through the connected mass of clay and mortar. He sketched the construction in his journal, noting the thickness of the walls and the arrangement of the fire chamber relative to the baking surfaces. The principle was simple but profound. Mass could store heat and release it over time. The bigger and denser the mass, the longer it held temperature. He visited a blacksmith's shop next and watched men working with iron and copper. He asked questions about how different metals conducted heat, which ones held temperature longest, which ones could withstand repeated heating and cooling without becoming brittle. The blacksmith's apprentice thought Ezra was planning to take up metalworking. Ezra didn't correct him. He just kept asking questions and taking notes. A brewery on the edge of town had a stone cellar dug 12 feet into the earth. The brewmaster gave Ezra a tour, explaining how the underground chamber maintained a constant cool temperature year-round without any ice or mechanical cooling. In summer, the cellar was significantly cooler than the air above. In winter, it was warmer than the frozen ground outside. The earth itself acted as insulation, moderating temperature extremes. Ezra realized the principle worked in both directions. If Earth could keep things cool in summer, it could keep things warm in winter. He found Leonard Price's metalworking shop through a recommendation from the blacksmith. Price specialized in custom copper work for stills, boilers, and industrial equipment. Ezra explained that he needed copper sheeting, heavy gauge, cut to specific dimensions. Price asked what he was building. Ezra said a heating system for a mountain cabin. Price assumed he meant decorative work or a fancy stove surround. He quoted a price that represented Ezra's entire season's profit. Ezra paid it without hesitation. He left street. Louis, in late June, with 40 pounds of copper sheeting, metalworking tools, and a design sketched in his journal that combined everything he'd learned. Other trappers heading back to the mountains saw his supplies and shook their heads. Everyone knew Ezra Holden had gone strange after his partner froze. Ezra returned to the mountains in late July 1839 and selected a new location for his cabin. He chose a site with good drainage on a slight rise above the creek, then began work that made every passing trapper stop and stare in confusion. Instead of cutting logs for walls, Ezra started digging a hole in the center of where his cabin floor would eventually be. The ground was rocky and dense, resisting the pickaxe and shovel with stubborn resistance. Ezra worked from dawn until dark, breaking through layers of soil and stone with hand tools that seemed inadequate for the task. He dug down 1 foot, then 2, then 3. The pit began to take shape, roughly circular, 4 feet across. Other trappers traveling through the area saw the excavation and couldn't understand what they were witnessing. Graham Sutton stopped by on his way to check trap lines in early August. He stood at the edge of the pit, watching Ezra work 3.5 feet below ground level. Graham was a practical man who had survived 8 winters in the Rockies by doing things the way everyone else did them. He asked Ezra directly what he was building. Ezra climbed out of the pit, wiped sweat from his face, and explained he was creating a heating system that would keep a cabin warm all winter with minimal fire tending. Graham looked at the hole, then at Ezra, then back at the hole. He said everyone knew that heat rises, which is why you build chimneys upward toward the sky, not pits downward into the earth. Digging down made no sense. Ezra tried to explain thermal mass and heat retention, but Graham cut him off. He said grief did strange things to men's minds, that losing Calvin had clearly affected Ezra's judgment, and that he should fill in the hole and build a normal cabin before winter arrived. Then Graham left, shaking his head. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Men made detours from their usual routes to see what Ezra Holden was doing. They found him working in a pit that had reached 4 feet deep, still digging, still expanding the circumference. Some offered genuine concern. Others made jokes. One trapper told Ezra he was digging his own grave. The comments spread as dark humor through camps and trading posts. Holden's digging his grave up near Blackfoot Creek. Lost his mind after Reed froze. Shame to see a decent trapper go crazy, Ezra ignored them all. When the pit reached its final dimensions, 4 feet deep and 4 feet across, he began the even more laborious work of lining it with stones. He needed flat rocks that would fit together tightly, and the nearest source was a creek bed 2 miles away. He made trip after trip, carrying stones that weighed 20 to 40 pounds each, selecting each one for how it would fit into the overall structure. The lining work took 5 full weeks. By late September, the stone-lined pit was complete. Trappers who saw it still had no idea what Ezra was building, but they were certain it was the project of a man who had lost his ability to think clearly. With the pit complete, Ezra began building the cabin structure around it. He constructed log walls using traditional notching methods, working alone through September 1839. The cabin took shape quickly now that the foundation work was finished, but the pit remained the central focus of every decision he made. The walls were positioned to place the pit exactly in the center of the interior space, maximizing heat distribution to all corners of the single room. While other trappers built simple cabins in 4 or 5 days, Ezra spent weeks on details that seemed irrelevant to anyone watching. He dug a horizontal tunnel from outside the cabin wall, angling it carefully to enter the stone-lined pit 18 inches below ground level. The tunnel was 2 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, just large enough to allow air flow but small enough to prevent heat loss. This would be his air intake, bringing fresh oxygen to feed the fire without creating drafts inside the living space. He built a small exhaust flue from the opposite side of the pit, using stones to create a chimney that rose through the cabin wall near floor level. The flue was only 5 inches in diameter, far smaller than any standard chimney. Ezra had calculated that a larger chimney would pull too much heat out of the system. He needed just enough draft to remove smoke and carbon monoxide, but not so much that it stole the warmth he was trying to retain. The mathematics of airflow consumed him. He tested different configurations using small fires, adjusting the height and angle of the exhaust flue, measuring how quickly smoke cleared and how much heat seemed to escape. Too much draft, and the fire burned too hot and fast, consuming wood rapidly while sending heat up the chimney. Too little draft and smoke backed up into the cabin, making the space uninhabitable. He found the balance through trial and error, adding or removing stones from the flue until the system worked correctly. With the cabin walls complete and the airflow system functional, Ezra turned his attention to the copper sheeting Leonard Price had sold him in Street Louis. He built a fire outside the cabin and heated the copper until it became malleable. Using a heavy hammer and a flat stone as an anvil, he shaped the metal into a circular lid 34 inches in diameter. The work required patience and precision. Copper could be worked when hot, but it had to be shaped gradually to avoid cracking or creating weak points that would fail under repeated heating and cooling. He turned the edges of the lid upward, creating a raised rim 1/2 inch high. This rim would sit in a groove he had carved into the stone at the top of the pit, creating a seal that would hold the lid in place while allowing him to lift it when necessary. He bolted an iron handle to the center of the lid, using rivets he had brought from Street Louis. The completed lid weighed 53 pounds, almost too heavy for Ezra to lift with one hand, but that weight was essential for what he intended. Late October 1839 brought the first serious cold to the northern Rockies. Ezra had finished the cabin construction, but he had not yet tested the underground pit system with a real fire. Everything he had built was based on theory. Observations from bakery ovens and brewery cellars, calculations about thermal mass and heat retention. Theory was valuable, but it could be fatally wrong. If the system failed during deep winter, Ezra would freeze the same way Calvin had. He spent 2 days preparing for the first test. He gathered 40 pounds of dried hardwood, oak and maple, that he had been seasoning for months. Dense hardwood burned hotter and longer than pine or spruce. He arranged the wood carefully in the stone-lined pit, building a structure that would allow air to circulate while maximizing the fuel load. He checked the horizontal air intake tunnel, making sure no debris blocked the opening. He verified that the exhaust flue was clear and properly positioned. On the morning of October 27th, Ezra started the fire. He used pine kindling and birch bark to establish initial flames, then added larger pieces of hardwood once the fire was burning steadily. The horizontal air intake provided excellent draft, and the fire grew quickly. Then smoke began filling the cabin. Ezra's calculations for the exhaust flue had been wrong. The opening was too small or positioned incorrectly, and smoke had nowhere to go except into the living space. He worked quickly, adjusting the flue opening by adding stones to increase height. The additional height created more draft. Smoke began flowing out through the flue instead of backing up into the cabin. Within 15 minutes, the air cleared. The fire established itself properly, burning with unusual intensity due to the concentrated heat reflecting off the stone walls of the pit. Ezra could feel warmth radiating upward even before he positioned the copper lid. He lifted the heavy lid and set it over the pit opening, leaving a 2-inch gap on one side to allow airflow. The copper began heating immediately. Within 30 minutes, the metal was too hot to touch. Within an hour, the entire surface glowed with absorbed heat. The cabin warmed rapidly, rising from 40 degrees to 65, then to 70. It was almost too warm. The system was more efficient than Ezra had calculated. He adjusted the lid to restrict airflow, leaving only a 1-inch gap. The fire settled into a controlled burn, flames visible through the opening, but not raging. The burn continued for 9 hours before the wood reduced to deep red coals. Ezra closed the lid completely except for a 1/2-inch gap. The coals continued burning, sustained by minimal oxygen from the intake tunnel. They lasted another 12 hours before finally dying out completely. Ezra did not sleep that first night. He sat watching the lid, monitoring the cabin temperature, listening for any sounds that might indicate structural problems or dangerous gas buildup. He was terrified of carbon monoxide poisoning, of cave-ins, of failures he had not anticipated, but the system held. The fire burned cleanly, the cabin stayed warm, and nothing collapsed. The fire from Ezra's first test burned completely out 22 hours after he had started it. The copper lid remained warm to the touch, radiating heat that had been absorbed during the long burn. The cabin temperature, which had peaked at 70 degrees during active burning, began dropping slowly. Ezra watched and recorded everything in his journal. After 6 hours with no fire, the cabin held at 62 degrees. After 12 hours, it had dropped to 58. After 24 hours, it stabilized at 55 degrees. He waited, resisting the urge to restart the botters. Fire. The stone-lined pit was releasing stored heat through the copper lid, exactly as he had theorized, but he needed to know how long the system could maintain livable temperature. On the second day, with no fire, the cabin remained at 53 degrees. Cold enough that he needed his wool shirt and jacket, but warm enough that water did not freeze and he could work comfortably. On the third day, the temperature dropped to 51 degrees and held there. The copper lid was still noticeably warm when he placed his hand on it. Not hot enough to burn, but warmer than the surrounding air. The thermal mass in the stone pit was continuing to release energy even 3 full days after the flames had died. On the fourth day, the temperature dropped to 49 degrees. Ezra added extra blankets to his sleeping platform, but did not light a fire. On the fifth day, the cabin held at 48 degrees. On the sixth day, it dropped to 46 degrees. The lid was now only slightly warmer than room temperature, barely perceptible to touch. On the seventh day, Ezra built a second fire. This time, he used only 15 pounds of wood, less than half the fuel load from his initial test. He burned it for 3 hours, just long enough to bring the copper lid back to high temperature and recharge the thermal mass in the stones. The cabin warmed to 65 degrees within an hour. He closed the lid and let the fire die to coals. The pattern repeated. The cabin stayed warm for days, cooled gradually to the upper 40s, then needed only a small maintenance burn to restore a comfortable temperature. Ezra realized he had created exactly what he had intended. A heating system that required 1 fire per week instead of 4 fires per day. The mathematics were remarkable. A traditional fireplace needed tending 480 times over a winter season. His underground pit system needed tending perhaps 20 times for the same period, but he had proven this only to himself. He was alone in his cabin with his success, and part of him wondered if the results would hold under more severe conditions. The weather in late October was cold, but not extreme. Deep winter would bring temperatures far below what he had tested. He began keeping detailed records: outside temperature, inside temperature, hours since last fire, pounds of wood consumed. The data confirmed his system worked, but he had not yet faced winter's worst. January 1840 brought weather that old trappers would remember for years. A cold front settled over the northern Rockies and refused to move. The temperature dropped to -35 degrees and stayed there for 8 consecutive days. Wind drove the cold into every crack and gap in even the best-built cabins. This was the kind of weather that killed men who made mistakes or had inadequate shelter. Graham Sutton's cabin was a quarter-mile from Ezra's, close enough that the two men occasionally crossed paths when checking trap lines. Graham had a traditional fireplace built against the north wall of his cabin, a solid construction that had served him well for 3 winters. But this cold snap pushed every system beyond normal limits. Graham's fireplace needed constant feeding to maintain even minimal warmth. He was burning wood at 3 times his usual rate, going through his carefully rationed supply with alarming speed. By the 6th day of the cold snap, Graham had burned through his entire month's worth of stored firewood. He had perhaps 2 days of fuel remaining, and the temperature showed no signs of rising. On the morning of the 7th day, with his wood supply nearly exhausted and the cold still holding at -30 degrees, Graham made a desperate decision. He would go to Ezra's cabin and ask for help, expecting to find Ezra in similar dire circumstances. Perhaps together they could salvage enough resources to survive until the weather broke. The quarter-mile walk through the brutal cold took Graham 20 minutes. Ice had formed in his beard despite the wool scarf wrapped around his face. His fingers were numb inside heavy mittens. He reached Ezra's cabin and knocked on the door. Ezra opened it, and warm air spilled out into the frozen morning. Ezra was wearing a single wool shirt, no heavy coat, no extra layers. The cabin behind him was unmistakably warm. Graham stepped inside and felt heat that seemed impossible given the conditions outside. He looked for the fire and saw none. No flames in a fireplace, no glowing coals, no smoke rising from any visible source. He asked Ezra where the fire was. Ezra pointed to the copper lid set flush in the floor. He explained that the last fire had burned out 3 days earlier. Graham stared at the metal lid and then at Ezra, certain he was being lied to or that exhaustion was affecting his perception. Ezra lifted the copper lid. Graham looked down into the stone-lined pit and saw only cold ash and the residual structure of burned wood from days earlier. No coals, no active heat source. He placed his hand on the stones lining the pit and felt warmth radiating from them. He touched the copper lid and found it noticeably warm despite being exposed to cabin air for the past minute. The stones were still releasing stored thermal energy 3 full days after the fire had died. Graham sat down heavily on Ezra's sleeping platform. Everything he understood about heating and survival had just been proven inadequate by a man everyone thought had gone insane. Graham stayed at Ezra's cabin for the remaining 2 days of the cold snap. Ezra shared his wood supply, and on the 9th day of the freeze, built a small maintenance fire. 20 pounds of wood burned for 4 hours. The heat from that single short burn kept both men comfortable for the next 3 days until the temperature finally began rising toward more normal winter levels. Graham watched the entire process with the attention of a man whose life might depend on understanding what he was witnessing. When the weather broke, Graham returned to his own cabin and began talking. He told other trappers what he had seen. A cabin heated for days without fire, a system that used a fraction of the wood required by traditional fireplaces, and a man sitting comfortable in shirt sleeves while the outside temperature measured cold enough to kill in minutes. Most trappers received the story with skepticism. Graham had a reputation for honesty, but what he described seemed impossible. In the spring of 1840, 3 trappers traveled to Ezra's location specifically to see the underground pit system. Ezra walked them through the construction process, explaining the physics of thermal mass and the purpose of each component. He showed them his journal with detailed measurements and temperature records from the entire winter. He lifted the copper lid and let them examine the stone-lined pit, the air intake tunnel, the exhaust flue. He answered every question without holding back information or claiming any special knowledge. The technique could be learned by anyone willing to invest the time and effort. Miles Garrett was among those 3 trappers. He was 52 years old, had been working the mountains for over 20 years, and had lost 2 partners to winter cold over that span. He understood survival odds better than most men. That summer, Miles built the first copy of Ezra's system at his cabin site 30 miles north. He modified the design slightly, using iron instead of copper for the lid because iron was cheaper and easier to obtain. He made his pit slightly larger, 5 feet across instead of 4. The basic principles remained the same. Miles' system worked. Over the next 2 years, 11 more underground pit systems were built across the northern trapping territories. Not every trapper adopted the technique. Many still considered it too much work or too expensive. The copper or iron lid alone cost more than most. Men wanted to spend. But those who faced serious winter conditions or who had experienced near-death cold began building what the trapping community started calling Holden pits. The name spread through journals and letters. Leonard Price in Street Louis began stocking heavier gauge copper sheeting after multiple trappers requested the same specifications Ezra had ordered. Traders and outfitters started mentioning the systems to new trappers heading into the mountains. The innovation was spreading organically, passing from man to man through demonstrated results rather than formal promotion. Ezra never charged money for the information. He never claimed credit or tried to profit from what he had built. He simply shared the technique with anyone who asked, the same way trappers had always shared knowledge of animal behavior, weather patterns, and survival methods. Winter 1856 arrived with the same brutal cold that had always defined the northern Rockies, but Ezra Holden was no longer there to experience it. He had left the mountains in 1844 when the fur trade collapsed and beaver prices fell below subsistence levels. He had built a small ranch in the Montana Territory, married in 1847, and started a family. His children knew their father had once been a trapper, but they knew nothing of underground pits or copper lids or innovations that had changed how men survived winter. Ezra returned to the mountains occasionally to visit Miles Garrett, who at 63 years old still ran trap lines and lived in the cabin he had built 16 years earlier. The underground pit system Miles had constructed in 1840 was still functioning perfectly. The copper lid had been replaced twice as the metal wore thin from repeated heating and cooling, but the stone-lined pit itself was unchanged. The thermal mass that had stored and released heat through 16 winters showed no signs of degradation or failure. They sat together in faster 18. Miles' cabin on a January afternoon while snow fell steadily outside. No fire burned in the pit. The last fire had been 3 days earlier, a maintenance burn that lasted 4 hours. The cabin temperature held at 52 degrees, cold enough to see breath fog slightly, but warm enough that neither man felt uncomfortable. Miles mentioned he had heard about a settler family near Fort Benton who had built a Holden pit in their homestead cabin the previous year. The system had saved them during a freeze when their children were sick and unable to tolerate the temperature swings of a traditional fireplace. Ezra thought about Calvin Reed, dead 17 years now, buried on a hillside 3 days' ride from where they sat. The innovation that had kept dozens of men alive through brutal winters had started with one man freezing to death because a fire went out. Everything that followed, every pit that was dug, every copper lid that was shaped and fitted, every life that was saved by retained heat. All of it traced back to that February morning when an adequate shelter had killed a good man. Miles asked if Ezra ever regretted not patenting the design or selling the plans to make money from what he had invented. Ezra watched his breath not quite fog in the warm cabin air. He said he had never built the system to make money. He had built it so nobody else would die the way Calvin had died. That had been enough. They sat in comfortable silence as afternoon faded toward evening. 2 old men staying warm in a mountain winter, heated by a fire that had burned out days ago and stones that remembered heat long after flames had been forgotten. Outside, the temperature dropped to -20 degrees. Inside, the copper lid set flush in the floor radiated gentle warmth into the growing darkness, a simple piece of metal that had changed how men survived the wilderness.